Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of NHLN Opinion Plus, a weekly series airing every Friday. This is a space for our opinions where we talk about current events and questions the Latino community is curious about. Today, we are joined by Moira O'Neill, the first director of the New Hampshire Office of the Child Advocacy. Welcome, Moira. It's great to have you here.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well, thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us this week. So some of the topics that we're going to be going over is just the impact, just like giving us an update on just the impact of COVID with child support and how the situation has been with supporting child advocacy within New Hampshire. Any questions before we begin?
No, I'm always welcome the opportunity to talk about young people. So thanks very much.
Absolutely. I love the enthusiasm. So yeah, let's start off by our conversation just by talking about, can you please give us an update on just the COVID situation in New Hampshire and just giving us an update on since the last time we spoke?
Yeah, sure. Someday, we're going to be spending years looking back and trying to figure out what happened during this period of time. There'll be lots of research on what happened and how it impacts kids. I think the first thing we're going to remember about this period of time is how exhausting it is. And I think what we're hearing from young people in particular, from children and from teenagers, is that we're really exhausted with the behavior of adults who aren't just following simple rules and doing some maybe uncomfortable things like wearing masks and getting vaccinated so that they can get back to school. It's really important that kids get back to school. Schools are opening now. Kids are there. There's still a lot of stress over these conversations around masks. And we're very worried about now an increasing number of kids showing up with COVID that they never had in the last year and a half. So we're still at a point where this pandemic is not over by any means, and it seems to be moving into an area where kids are going to be affected in a different way.
Absolutely. So just like, from the news and just from hearing about just like child support and child education, like in southern states, I mean, there is like an increase within COVID cases within children. More children, you're seeing them in the hospital, and there still isn't a vaccine for children. So what does education look like in New Hampshire? Are kids still going to school virtually, or are they having a hybrid version within New Hampshire? And can you talk about just what does COVID look like, when it appears in children in New Hampshire?
Yeah. So we've been lucky in the Northeast. The northern part of New England has not seen the cases of COVID that the rest of the country has. So it's always felt as though we're ahead of things. But today there's a lot of people in the hospital, more so than were so last year at this time. So we're not free of it. It's my understanding most of the schools are open now. And children are at school in person, which is great. It's really important that kids are able to be at school and be with each other. Where we're seeing a lot of stress and contention is around mask mandates. So it's been left up to the individual schools to determine what the policy is. And what we're hearing from young people is, let us just wear our masks and get to school so we can move on. One of the reasons that being in school is so important, or one of the outcomes that we've seen over the last year and a half that worries us the most, is the number of kids who have had mental health crises because they weren't in school. And we still have a long list of kids waiting in emergency rooms to get access to care. And there are kids who have never been in the psychiatric system before. So this is very serious, and it's important that kids can get to school safely.
That is a very interesting point. Like I guess within the pandemic, obviously mental health has been a big topic within all conversations from all realms. You've seen, Simone Biles and, Michael Phelps speak on those topics within the Olympics this past summer. But can you explain more? Like you mentioned that kids are appearing more within the emergency rooms, or just having requiring emergency services. What is causing, what within mental health issues is leading them to emergency services, and can you explain what type of stress is that creating for both kids and parents?
Yeah, sure. I mean, New Hampshire has fairly limited access to mental health services for kids, especially acute hospitalizations. So when they come into the emergency room, they can get packed up and wait for days and days, some even for months. And so it's really important that we understand what's going on with them. In those kids that we didn't expect would end up needing psychiatric care, a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression. And so, we need to really look at what's happening and how do we support them at home, because it's traumatizing just to go to the emergency room. And so New Hampshire is trying to build out community-based services. We're a couple of years late in establishing mobile crises, so people who can actually come to your home and help you work out the crises that you're in. And what we've seen, a great example of a demonstration of this stress. There's an annual arts contest called Magnify Voices, which is a really wonderful opportunity for young students to use art as a form of expression about what it is to live with mental illness. And in our contest this past year, all of the submissions, whether they were in print art, painting, poetry, music, video, it really focused on that experience. The mask was really well represented and focused on the experience of covering up who you are, what you're experiencing, and what's going on behind that mask. And we saw kids really able to express a high level of sort of distress in being in a situation that they couldn't control, and they couldn't be with each other to work through it. So that's why we're back at really important that kids are in school and well supported there, and adults need to do their job so that they have a healthy, safe situation.
Absolutely. I mean, those are all really, really great points. And I think just like by art, because, within children, like their language is play, and art is a great way to just translate how they feel, like into just like imagery and pictorial images, which is
Yeah.
really great way to understand how, like, what type of lives and what feelings children are going through. So can you explain more on, like, what methods are you using to kind of like identify, some of the issues that these children go through, whether it be in mental health or child abuse or neglect? Just what methods are you using to identify that, okay, these are the children that need help and that we need to assist them like right away?
Yeah, so the Office of the Child Advocate, just to step back a little bit to explain my role, I'm the child advocate for the state, and our office is an independent oversight agency of all children's services. So we can sort of do surveillance on children's well-being based on how the state is serving them and when problems arise. And what's really important is understanding what are children's experiences that bring them into any system, whether it's healthcare, whether it's psychiatric care, whether it's child protection. And so, for example, one of the things we might do is look at those kids who are in the emergency room, or look at those kids who are incarcerated, and try to understand their backgrounds and what their experience has been in the past. Have their parents had the what they needed to be good parents? Have they been able to provide them stable housing and stable food and getting them to school? Have they experienced abuse or neglect? Have they been exposed to trauma, domestic violence, substance use? And when we understand those things, we can take a few steps further back. A famous bishop from South Africa, Desmond Tutu, talked about how we're so busy pulling kids out of the river that it would be helpful if we go back upstream and help the kids before they fall into the river. So there's this whole movement about doing upstream prevention to keep kids from falling into distress. And so we're learning from the kids who are in the system now, whether they're in the emergency department or incarcerated or in foster care, by looking at where could they have gotten help a little bit earlier in their lives, or where could their parents have gotten help earlier in their lives, or their teachers, so that they don't end up in these circumstances.
That is very interesting. So, you mentioned, there are different realms that you focus on: emergency, incarceration, and foster care. So with that being said, can you explain like what are some of the differences when trying to help or when trying to focus on children of different backgrounds, whether that be ethnicity, socioeconomic status, documentation, and just from underserved communities? Like what differences do you see from kids from these different communities that you see that end up in emergency or in foster care or in incarceration? And do you see any like struggles within certain communities or backgrounds?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we talk about a lot is, child protection when people worry about kids. what are we looking at? Are we looking at children who are being abused and neglected, or are we looking at poverty? There's a lot of people who are judging how children are raised based by sort of pre-existing expectations of what people do, and that may be complicated. The same thing with delinquency. Is a child committing a crime because he's a bad kid, or is he hungry, or has he got some real dysfunction happening at home? And so we do see some disparities. We see a lot of people who are reported for child abuse or neglect, from impoverished backgrounds. We do see some disparity in the reporting and in the delinquency of kids who are African American and, of course, Latinx. We see Latinx kids represented a little bit more in terms of being arrested or being sent to the incarceration, as well as we do with African American kids. And this is a very hard concept for us here in New Hampshire because it's a very white state. And so no one really thinks that race or ethnicity would be a problem because we are so white here. But that would mean that there should be fewer kids who are in child protection or fewer kids who are on probation or incarcerated who are Black or Latinx. And in fact, there's more. And when I visit our youth prison, the Sununu Youth Services Center, what I see are Black and brown faces. So clearly, something is happening where we're interpreting more severely for some families than we are for others.
Very interesting. So you mentioned that within these three sites that you mentioned, there's a lot more Black and brown and Latinx faces. So so like with that, like what are some of the programs, or what are some like methods that you're doing to help these communities, not just to serve the children that may be coming from these very rough backgrounds, so that they hopefully don't get to those extreme points? And how do you also assist the parents too, because it's not just the pressure of the children, it's also a lot of pressure on the parents and whatever relationship they may be in. Just how are you trying to satisfy these communities and try to assist both the children and the parents?
Sure, you're right on many levels there. So there's a couple things that are happening here. One, there's a really big, huge effort to transform how we do juvenile justice altogether. We're changing probation and trying to make it a little bit more focused on positive youth development, helping incentivizing kids because they respond better to incentives, and also understanding them a little better and understanding ourselves too. Are we making different decisions because we have pre-existing perceptions about kids, and how are we supporting them? The other thing that I think is more important, that I'm really excited about, that's finally coming to fruition, is where we're doing some efforts to bring young people to speak for themselves, because all of the changes that have happened in New Hampshire have not included children's voices, particularly on the juvenile justice side. So we're just about to we're supporting the launch of a program that is youth-driven, that will provide grants to advocacy organizations to hire young people who are experts in the juvenile justice system because they've been there. And they will be doing some education outreach, and also educating our legislators when they're making policy. And in return, we'll provide them with some really good training on how to do advocacy, how to tell their story safely, and how to get the word out about how important each one of their lives is.
Absolutely. That's a lot of great work. So I think my last question, what do you think are some of the most important resources that our audience should know to, better be educated on, child advocacy in New Hampshire?
Oh, great. That's a great question. I hope that if there are folks in your audience who are in New Hampshire, that they'll contact my office about this big youth project that we're coming along. They may be part of a provider organization or an advocacy organization which would like to hire what we're calling youth justice stewards, and get the funding to be able to pay for them. I hope that there are young people who might want to play that role, or join us in some way. There's also lots of opportunities through NAMI New Hampshire, which is the National Alliance for Mental Illness. They do a lot of work in advocacy, and they partner with an organization called Youth Move, which is all young people who are supporting and providing peer support for other young people who are may have mental illness or be involved in the system. And those young people who are in foster care or institutionalized by the state, the Youth Advisory Board really needs their input. So any opportunity, and then just simply, look around you in your community. Who's your legislator? Who's your mayor? Talk to them. Don't be shy, because none of those people are expert in young people's experience like you are. It's really important that young people tell their story and give some advice about how we should be running the state.
Absolutely. That's all very insightful. Thank you so much. And so, Director O'Neill, thank you so much for joining us this week, and for being our guest on NHLN Opinion Plus. Is there any last things that you would like to say to our audience before we close out?
Well, thank you for this opportunity. My number one message these days is please put a mask on, get vaccinated, support kids to go back to school. That's the most important thing that we can do right now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Director O'Neill.
Great, thanks.
And join us for another episode in 2 weeks. For more information about our discussion today, check out our web store at NHLatinonews.com. Follow us on Twitter at NHLatinoNews and our Instagram at NH_Latino News. I'm Bron Sapana with NHLN Opinion Plus, and we'll see you next time.